Last time I spoke kind of in generalities about lawmen in the Old West and what that entailed, the different types of peace officers, and so forth. This time I'm going to talk about some specific individuals, some of the more famous of those specific individuals. Now, for many of my college students who are probably watching this as part of our class, some of these names may be completely new. In fact, while I've found that over the last 10, 12 years when I've been teaching these classes, I've found that several students in any given class have usually heard of Wyatt Earp and say Doc Holliday. I have yet to have a class where one single person had ever heard of Bat Masterson, for instance. And Bat Masterson was practically a household name when I was a kid in the 1970s. So if you're someone who has just come across this video because it looked interesting, you are going to be familiar with most or all of the people I talk about, and you might know quite a bit about them. Nonetheless, here we go. We're going to start with this guy, Wild Bill Hickok. Real name James Butler Hickok. You may wonder how the heck do you get Wild Bill out of James Butler? And, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk a little bit about Hickok's background. He was from Illinois. In fact, his father had been an abolitionist and had used their home as offered up their home as a stop, as a station along the Underground Railroad in the 1850s. His father was named William Hickok. That William Hickok died when James Butler Hickok was a teenager, in his early teens, in fact. Hickok wound up leaving Illinois after getting in a fight with another young guy, and they both fell in the river, and each one thought the other one had drowned, and that they were going to be wanted for murder, and so Hickok lit out, as they say, left the state, and he started going by his father's name, William Hickok. So that's how he became Bill. He went to Kansas initially, and he was in Kansas for a good while. When he was 18 years old, which would have been 1855, he arrived in Kansas and joined up with the Jayhawkers, which were the sort of the informal militia of abolitionists there in Kansas who were in an undeclared but quite serious war with the informal militia of the pro-slavery people who had come into the state. This was the era known as Bleeding Kansas, and young Bill Hickok was right in the middle of it. This is where he met William F. Cody, future to be known as Buffalo Bill, who was several years younger than him, and who served as a scout for their group. Anyhow, after the years in Kansas, he wound up in Missouri, where he was for a while a stagecoach driver. It was while he was a stagecoach driver that he was involved in his first shooting. A guy named McCandless, who came to the stagecoach station in a pretty foul temper, trying to recover some money owed to him by the stagecoach station manager, and then there was a shooting. Hickok was not arrested for that one. He wound up shortly after that joining the Union Army and served in the Union Army during the Civil War, initially as a teamster. So for those of you who don't know what a teamster is, it's a person that drives wagons. But he wound up eventually being in what today we would call the military police. He was, in fact, the provost marshal in Springfield, Missouri. The provost marshal is the person who's in charge of the local MPs. So there was his first law enforcement experiences. After the war was over, he stayed there in Springfield He became a gambler. And in 1865, 66, somewhere around in there, not too long after the war had ended, got in an argument with another gambler there in Springfield named Dave Tutt. And they squared off against each other in the town square in a previously arranged duel, and stood there and drew their guns and started shooting. And Hickok came out on top in the sense that he was alive when it was over with. This is one of the very rare occasions in the Old West where things played out the way they do in the movies, so far as two guys facing off in the middle of town on the town streets and drawing their guns in a duel. And it may have been the first such recorded instance. Anyhow, after that, he started serving as a scout for the cavalry. And he did that off and on for the next several years. A large part of that time he was serving as a scout for the 7th Cavalry under the command of Custer, George Armstrong Custer. So this was the time period, the late 1860s, during which Custer was fighting the Cheyenne Indians and when the Washita incident took place. He also served briefly as a scout for either the 9th or 10th Cavalry, one of the Buffalo Soldier outfits. In 1869, actually 1867, he was appointed a Deputy United States Marshal in Hays City, Kansas. So he was operating out of the district court in Hays City. And he also kind of did some cavalry scouting on the side during that time. In 1869, there was a special election to replace the marshal of the city, and temporarily until the regular election could be held. He wound up getting elected county sheriff and became the town marshal. He held both of those positions in Hays City for a few months, after which he was just the county sheriff. So he spent about a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer, in Hays City. During that time, killed several people, killed a couple of drunks, disruptive, violent drunk cowboys. Got in a fight with a couple of cavalry troopers and killed one of them. Eventually, he wound up. He lost his bid for re-election and moved from Hays City up to Abilene. So 1871, he was appointed the Marshal of Abilene, and he was there for a couple of years. By the way, I forgot to mention that after that shootout with Dave Tutt, there was a reporter came around, wrote a piece about Hickok for Harper's Weekly, which was a very popular national magazine, in which he greatly exaggerated Hickok's background, had him killing 100 people and so forth. But that was the beginning of Hickok's legend right there. And then that's the reason, if you recall, earlier when we were talking about dime novels, when Ned Buntline had read an article about Wild Bill Hickok and headed west to try to find him and write a dime novel about him. That's what he had read. Anyhow, Hickok, by the early 1870s, is the town marshal in Abilene. There he met a young cowboy, also a gunfighter and a guy on the run for previous killings named John Wesley Hardin. They generally hit it off, although Hickok made it clear that he was looking to arrest him after Hardin had famously shot a guy through the wall that was staying in the room next to him and snoring too loudly and disturbing him. And Hardin left town before the two of them had any kind of a confrontation. Before that happened, though, one of Hardin's friends, a guy named Phil Coe, had a run-in with Wild Bill Hickok. Phil Coe was co-owner of the Bull's Head Saloon. His partner was Ben Thompson, that we'll talk about later on. Thompson was a famous gunfighter in the Old West. And in their saloon, they had a large painting, very graphic painting of a bull with an erection, which several people complained about, and Marshal Hickok came in and told them that they had to take down, and they refused to do it. Dadgum Yankee trying to tell us what to do. And so he blacked out the offending body part of the bull, which really made him mad. And so Coe in particular really had it in for Hickok after that. And one evening, they ran into each other on the street, and Coe went for his gun, and Hickok fired first and shot him dead. And then he heard somebody running up behind him, so he whirled around and shot that person. And it turns out that was his own deputy. So that's not a good career move, actually. He was relieved of his duties in 1873 as town marshal in Abilene. After that, he briefly tried to have his own Wild West show that just didn't work out too well. And that's when he was invited by his old friend, Buffalo Bill, to join his Wild West show as a marksman, as well as in his stage production that Ned Buntline had written. Wild Bill Hickok, turns out, was not a stage actor, didn't like it too much. He was kind of shy when all the attention was on him in that way. Also, he was starting to have problems with his eyesight, failing eyesight. And when he was up there on the stage, the bright lights disoriented him and made him very irritable. And one night the spotlight was put on him suddenly, and he shot it out. So he didn't last that long with his old friend Buffalo Bill. After that, he continued serving as a cavalry scout off and on, continued traveling around, gambling. That was his last time, though, in Abilene, I believe, of serving as a peace officer. Also, it was his last, what you would call, pitched gunfight, although not his last experience with gunfire. You may be aware, if you know about Wild Bill Hickok, what eventually happened. Before I tell you about that, one more thing about Phil Coe. When they were arguing there in the Bull's Head Saloon, and Coe was threatening Marshal Hickok. Coe said, he was bragging, he said, "I can hit a crow on the wing." And Hickok reportedly said to him, "Yes, but does the crow have a gun, and is the crow shooting back? Because I will be." And turns out, yes, he was. Anyhow, in 1876, Hickok, who was recently married, his wife's name was Agnes, but he was still traveling around gambling. He met in the town of Deadwood Martha Jane Canary. They may have both been scouting for the cavalry at the same time. Martha Jane Canary, alias Calamity Jane, who would later claim that they had been not just close friends, but lovers. No one was able to ask Hickok if that was a true story or not. Due to the actions of 23-year-old Jack McCall. One evening, actually the evening of August the 1st, 1876, Jack McCall, who was pretty inebriated, was in a saloon, and a chair opened up in a poker game, and he took it. And Wild Bill Hickok was one of the players. After just a few hands, McCall had lost all of his money. Hickok gave him a little bit of money to buy his breakfast with the next day, and advised him not to play anymore until he was able to cover his debts, which McCall accepted the money but was insulted. The next evening, Hickok was once again in that saloon playing cards, and this time, he did not sit in the corner, which was his custom. He would always sit with his back to the corner so that he could see the whole room, see the door, and no one could come up behind him. But for whatever reason, maybe because it was the only seat that was open, he took a seat on the opposite side of the table with his back to the door. And Jack McCall walked in and swore at him and shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. So at the age of 39, that was the end of Wild Bill Hickok. Famously, the cards that he was holding, his last hand, that is now known, immediately came to be known as the dead man's hand in poker, was he had a pair of aces and a pair of eights. So aces and eights, dead man's hand. We don't know what his fifth card was. Wild Bill Hickok was one of several famous lawmen, gunfighters, and/or outlaws to have died violently in the Old West. Usually, in most of the cases of the famous ones, they were shot from behind or from ambush. Well, Wild Bill has been portrayed on the screen many times down through the years, and in most of those portrayals from before 1970, he looked like this. Short hair and clean shaven, because virtually every male actor was portrayed, especially the leading men actors were portrayed with short hair and clean shaven from the 1920s until the mid 1960s. Even historical figures famous for their long hair and beards, like Wild Bill Hickok and George Armstrong Custer. This is Guy Madison, who starred in The Adventures of Wild Bill Hickok on television for 8 seasons from 1951 to 1958. Now, every once in a while, there would be a more accurate portrayal. Very rare, but it did happen every once in a while, like in 1950 in the film Dallas, starring Gary Cooper, in which you had as a supporting character Wild Bill Hickok, looking a little bit more like you would expect him to. Now, here are some of the film portrayals of Hickok since 1970. The one on the far right, for my money, is probably the best one. Keith Carradine as Hickok in the TV series Deadwood that was on HBO in the mid-aughts. Did a fantastic job as Wild Bill Hickok. Probably a second, close second would be Jeff Corey in the lower left-hand corner there in 1970 in Little Big Man, although he was a little old for the part since Wild Bill was only 39 when he died. And I would say that Jeff Bridges in the upper left in the movie Wild Bill and Sam Elliott in the TV miniseries Buffalo Girls both did a serviceable and pretty good job. Probably the less said about Luke Hemsworth and the 2017 movie Hickok, the less said about that probably the better. Next up on the docket, so to speak, Wyatt Earp. Now, can't talk about Wyatt Earp for very long without also talking about his brothers and his boon companion John Doc Holliday. So we will be talking about those folks as well, and several other interesting characters. Now, when I'm teaching this as a class, my students are assigned usually to read this book, The Last Gunfight, which I highly recommend. That's about the gunfight at the OK Corral and has a lot of back story and information about the Earps. So for my students watching this, they probably already read the book and written their paper about it. So what I'm going to be discussing next are just kind of some survey highlights and reminders for them. But really feel like I have to give the subject justice. Can't talk about Lawmen and not spend a good bit of time on Wyatt Earp. So here's a photograph of Wyatt Earp at the age of about 21. Earp was born 1848 in Illinois. His family moved to Iowa, where he grew up. Later, when he was about 16, the whole family moved out to California for a short time. He had five brothers and three sisters, and he was smack dab in the middle. He had three older brothers, two younger brothers. Several of the brothers are going to come into this story. Now, when the Civil War started, Wyatt was 13 years old. His three older brothers all joined the Union Army and fought in the war. He ran away from home and tried to enlist several times, but was turned down because he was obviously underage, and his father came and got him each time. All right, well, family went out to California for a while. He worked as a teamster out there. Then, when he was about 20, the whole family moved back eastward to Missouri, to Lamar, Missouri, where his dad got a job as constable. This was in 1868. The summer of 1869, when Wyatt was 21, so right around the time this picture was taken, he was involved in an altercation in Beardstown, Illinois, um, in a in a house of prostitution, in a brothel. He got in an argument with another guy. The guy called him a California boy because he was from California, but that was also kind of a euphemism for coward at that time, implying somebody who had run off to California to avoid the Civil War. And Wyatt was insulted, and they came to blows, and then they each drew their guns and fired at each other. The other guy missed, and Wyatt's shot hit the guy in the hip, injuring him, not killing him. And that was probably Wyatt Earp's first gunfight at the age of 21. So that's a little bit of a harbinger of things to come. The fact that it happened in a brothel was also kind of a harbinger of things to come. Now, later that year in the fall, November of 69, his father kind of got a promotion to Justice of the Peace, and 21-year-old Wyatt Earp took his dad's place as the constable. So that was probably his first, well, it wasn't probably, it was his first law enforcement experience. It was kind of a low-level kind of experience. Constables mostly serve papers and stuff. He also, around that time, got married to a young woman named, I believe it was Urilla. The marriage didn't last long, less than a year, because his young wife, died of typhoid fever while she was pretty far along in pregnancy with their first child, who did not survive either. So that sent young Wyatt into kind of a spiral, and things kind of fell apart for him pretty quickly there for a while. He wound up basically being caught skimming money to try to pay his debts, skimming money that he was supposed to be collecting for the city. Also was caught falsifying documents so as to be able to skim money, and he was even accused, along with a couple of his friends, of stealing some horses out in Indian territory, for which he was fired from his job and indicted. But he skipped town. He didn't just skip town. He skipped out of Missouri completely. And so that was pretty much the end of his Missouri experience. And after that, he wound up going to Kansas. And while he was in Kansas, he and his younger brother Morgan were arrested several times for pimping, for living in a house of prostitution, serving as pimps and bouncers. Also arrested once on a riverboat for the same charge. He wound up with a 16-year-old young prostitute named Sally as his companion, his common law wife. They were together for several years, about 6 years, I think. And in various places for the next couple of years, he was working along with his brother, if you can call it that, as a pimp and a bouncer. Now later, when he was telling his life story to Stuart Lake in 1930, he said that he had been a buffalo hunter in Kansas at this time, which was not true. There's no evidence that he was ever a buffalo hunter. Now, his friend Bat Masterson was a buffalo hunter. That was probably just to cover up and explain away these couple of years when actually what he was a pimp. Whoops, I have to correct myself. I just misspoke. Wyatt Earp's pimping years, or his prime pimping years, were not in Wichita, but at that time in Peoria, Illinois, where he had fled after that horse stealing charge in Missouri. So it was in Peoria that he and his brother first started getting in trouble for their association with prostitution, and where he met his girlfriend Sally. Then, in 1874, Wyatt and Sally went to Wichita, Kansas. That's when they went to Wichita. His older brother James and James's wife Nellie were operating a brothel there in Dodge. So they moved down there, moved in with James and Nellie, and Nellie and Sally co-managed the brothel for a couple of years. And Wyatt got a job as a faro dealer in a local saloon. Now, if you don't know what faro is, it's a card game that rivaled poker in popularity back during that time period. In April of 1875, Wyatt got hired on as a deputy to the town marshal. So this was his first deputy marshal job, and turned out he was pretty good at it. Of course, he was still dealing cards at the saloon, and probably also still bouncer at the brothel. But he actually won the respect of a lot of the people in town because of his performance on the job. That lasted for about a year, at which time, the following April of '76, somebody made Wyatt mad by accusing him of corruption because he had used his position to get several of his brothers hired on as deputies. So he beat the guy up, and he wound up being charged with assault and fined $30, and the city council decided not to renew his contract. Shortly after that, James and Nellie decided to leave Wichita and move to Dodge City, which had replaced Abilene as the most happening of the booming cattle towns. And Wyatt came along. By this time, apparently, he had broken up with Sally, because that's where she drops out of the story. So they moved to Dodge City, and within a month, Wyatt had gotten a position in the marshal's office there as a deputy to the town marshal, and gotten a job dealing faro at the Long Branch Saloon, which you can see there in the top, as well as an interior view. We mentioned the TV show Gunsmoke a couple of times. The Long Branch Saloon played a large role in that series, although in the show, fictionally, it was owned by Miss Kitty Russell. At this point, it was owned by Luke Short, who was a well-known gambler and a bit of a gunfighter himself. Anyway, Wyatt is working here in Dodge. And then later on, after being there for a short while, he and his brother Morgan headed up to Deadwood in the Dakota Territory to try to make their fortune. And they got there in September of 1876, just about a month or so after the murder of Wild Bill Hickok. And they were there for several months, but they didn't strike it rich and they couldn't make a living. So they came back to Dodge City and he got back on with the marshal's office. Then, in the late fall of 1877, this guy enters the story, at least briefly. His name was Dave Rudabaugh, also known as Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. He was an outlaw, and he robbed a railroad camp not far from Dodge City, and headed west. Wyatt was sworn in as a temporary United States Marshal, Deputy United States Marshal, to give him the jurisdiction to track him down. And so he followed him westward to Texas for over 400 miles. Finally, near, I think, Fort Clark, he came into a saloon and where he actually knew the guy that ran the saloon, and learned that he had just missed Dirty Dave by a few days. But the saloon owner said, Dave is friends with that gambler over there. He might know where he went. You should go ask him. So Wyatt introduced himself to the gambler, a guy named Doc Holliday, or actually John Holliday, a dentist from Georgia who had traveled west for his health because he had tuberculosis and it was just too humid for his lungs in the South. So he got out west and discovered that he was a lot better at gambling than he was at dentistry. So he told Wyatt Earp that Dave had left and said he was headed back to Dodge City. So Wyatt turned around, went back to Dodge, and not too long after that, Doc Holliday also arrived in Dodge with his common-law wife, a woman known as Big Nose Kate. And Dirty Dave kind of disappeared from the story. Wyatt never caught up with him. He actually had doubled back, gone west again, wound up not too long after that in New Mexico, where he was contending with Billy the Kid, and he'll re-enter our story when we get to that part. So by 1878, Wyatt has concluded his temporary stint as a federal marshal, and he's back there in Dodge City working for the marshal's office. Here's a photograph from around that time period of the assistant town marshal, Wyatt Earp, seated on the left, and his friend, his good friend there, Bartholomew Masterson, alias Bat Masterson, who was the deputy sheriff of Ford County, and within a short time got elected sheriff of Ford County. We'll be talking in more detail we'll be talking in more detail soon about Masterson. But I do have to correct myself again from just a minute ago. I said that Wyatt discovered Rudabaugh was headed back to Dodge City, but he never caught up with him, and that's true. But he did telegraph ahead to Bat Masterson in Dodge City, who actually then caught Dave Rudabaugh and some of his accomplices. However, Dirty Dave testified against his accomplices and was released. And then he headed out to New Mexico, where he became a member of Billy the Kid's gang. Here's a famous photograph from 1883 of what was called, quote unquote, the Dodge City Peace Commission. We'll talk in a little bit about the Dodge City War and how this photograph came to be. But here you can see some of the people that we've been talking about. You got Wyatt Earp there in the front, Bat Masterson in the back, and Luke Short, also called Lucky Luke Short, a gambler and co-owner of the Long Branch Saloon, along with William H. Harris. Short was short. He was about 5'6". You also have the town marshal at the time, Charles Bassett, who had also previously been county sheriff. You've got over in the right seated Neil Brown, who was a deputy United States marshal, Frank McCain, a gambler friend of Luke Short's, and W.F. Pedalon, who was the Ford County clerk. Fine, upstanding group of guys. Not long after Doc Holliday arrived in Dodge City, an incident occurred at the Long Branch Saloon. Apparently, a large group of cowboys had been shooting up the streets and then rushed into the saloon and started harassing the customers. Earp, having heard the gunshots, rushed to the site and rushed through the door of the Long Branch Saloon only to find at least half a dozen pistols pointed at him, at which point Doc Holliday, who had been at a table gambling, stood up and walked over to the leader of the cowboys and put his pistol to the man's head and ordered him to tell all of his men to lower their weapons, which they did. So Wyatt Earp credited Doc Holliday with saving his life on that occasion, and that was most likely the moment when their lifelong friendship began. Here are the Earp brothers. Now, Newton, the eldest, was actually the child of the Earp's father from a previous marriage, so he was a half brother to the others. He didn't seem to be as close to them as they were to each other. Now, after the Civil War, in which he and James and Virgil all served, Newton, who had just gotten married, accompanied the rest of the family out to California. And then when they came back to Lamar, Missouri, he came back with them there. He wound up eventually going to Kansas and being a farmer, and he actually, for some time, served as a town marshal in a small town in Kansas. And then later he moved out to Northern California, where he spent the remaining decades of his life not getting involved in the various scrapes of the Earps, and worked as a carpenter for many, many years. Now, the other Earps tended to stick together. Virgil was appointed the Deputy United States Marshal for the Tombstone Mining District in Arizona in 1879. Now, the town of Tombstone had been formed in March of 1879. Virgil, who also spent a short time as deputy sheriff there, wrote back to his brothers in Dodge City that Tombstone was a booming town, which Dodge had been when they got there, but it was starting to die down now. As deputy sheriff, Virgil had learned that when you are the full sheriff of the county, you get 10% of the tax proceeds, by the way, which could add up in a mining town to the equivalent of $800,000-900,000 a year now. Anyhow, that was all it took for Wyatt Earp and his new common law wife, Maddie, who had succeeded Sally and who was also a former prostitute, for Wyatt and Maddie and James and his wife Nellie to head on out there to join Virgil. And it wasn't very long before the younger brothers, Morgan and Warren, had joined them as well. And wasn't very long at all, by the way, Wyatt and Jim and their families had joined Virgil by December of 1879. So the town was only a few months old when they got there. A short time later, Doc Holliday, who was practically an adopted Earp brother, he showed up too with Big Nose Kate, with a whole lot of money because he had done some gambling along the way. He had $40,000 on him when he got there, which was quite a lot. So by 1880, the Earps and Holliday were already ensconced in the town of Tombstone. And it wasn't too long after that that Virgil was appointed the town marshal of Tombstone, in addition to being a federal marshal. Town marshal, when the previous marshal had been shot and killed by Curly Bill Brocious. Now, it would easily take at least an hour, maybe two, to thoroughly explain the situation, the political situation that developed there in Tombstone, and provide all the context. There have been whole books and movies about that. So I'm going to cut to the chase and give you the simple version. Okay. And you can look up the details, read some of those books, read that book that I mentioned earlier. Also, a lot of great novels. Anyhow, there was a group of small ranchers who sort of hung together that have come to be known as the Cochise County Cowboys. And they had a lot of bad blood between them and the Earps over the next year or two. They were accused by the Earps of being involved in various kinds of robberies. Of course, Curly Bill Brocious had shot the previous marshal in the groin, which was ruled an accident. And it was just escalating over time. You also had Johnny Behan, who had kind of a career politician, peace officer, who had managed to get that position as Cochise County Sheriff that Virgil Earp had wanted, and who tended to side with these Cochise County Cowboys. We'll just call them the Cowboys. That's how they refer to themselves. In general, this group of cowboys was led by Ike Clanton. You can see him there right in the middle. And there's his younger brother, Billy Clanton. You've also got Billy Claiborne. You've got the McLowry brothers. And you had several others. You had Stillwell, you had Wes Fuller, but these five I have pictured because they're the ones who were involved in the most famous event involving any of the Earps, and maybe the most famous event in all of the Wild West. That was, of course, the gunfight at the OK Corral, which could more accurately be called the gunfight at a vacant lot kind of close to the OK Corral. You can see it was a lot closer to C.S. Fly's photography studio than it was to the corral. Fly is the one who took that picture of Ike Clanton that we saw in the previous slide. Well, things came to a head. Virgil Earp, the town marshal, deputized his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, and Doc Holliday came along. And they went to have a confrontation with the Clantons, who were armed, at least some of them, which was against the town ordinance, by the way. They started shooting at each other. And they shot at each other for approximately 30 seconds. During that time, Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne made their escape. And the other three who were with them, Billy Clanton, who was 19 years old, and the McLowry brothers, who were, I think one was in his early 30s, the other in his late 20s, those three were dead. And on the side of the town marshal and his brothers and their gambler friend, everyone had been injured, had been wounded in some way, except for Wyatt Earp. Virgil had a bullet in the calf. Morgan had a bullet graze along his two shoulder blades along his back. Doc Holliday had was creased by a bullet. And when the smoke cleared, there were 3 dead cowboys. Now, there was mixed feeling in the town of Tombstone because about half the people, maybe more, were on the side of the cowboys, not the Earps. Here are the 3 dead cowboys, the McLowry brothers and young Billy Clanton, being fully displayed in their caskets. There was also a sign put up that said "Murdered on the Streets of Tombstone." The Earps and Holiday were actually charged with murder, and there was a trial, but it was ruled that they had acted within their rights as officers of the law, and so that was the end of it. Except that wasn't really the end of it. The Cowboys, which included Ike Clanton, who was still alive and kicking, and Curly Bill and others, um, got their revenge. Virgil Earp was shot while walking on the streets of Tombstone with his wife with a shotgun, which maimed his left arm permanently. Not long after that, Morgan Earp was playing pool in a billiard house, and someone shot him through the window and killed him. At this point, Wyatt Earp wired the U.S. Marshal of the district and requested to be deputized as a deputy U.S. Marshal so that he could go after the killers. And he was, in fact, deputized. And then he deputized a bunch of other people, including Doc Holliday and his brother Warren. James Earp took Morgan's body back home to Missouri, so he was out of the equation. And for the next 2 weeks, Wyatt Earp and his posse kind of just rode roughshod through Arizona, hunting down the cowboys that they viewed as responsible. And there were several skirmishes. Before it was over, Curly Bill Brocious had been shot dead by Wyatt Earp, and three more cowboys had been killed as well before the drive for revenge started to abate as they were running out of people to get revenge on. And so that was the end of what's known as the as the Earp Vendetta ride. And that was then the end of the conflict between the Cowboys and the Clantons and the Earps. Wasn't too long after that Doc Holliday succumbed to his tuberculosis and died of it. Wyatt Earp had a couple more peace officer jobs after that, but for the most part, he and his wife Josephine. I thought about talking about his love life in more detail, but it's so complicated. Anyway, they wound up traveling around the country. At one point, his occupation was listed as capitalist, investing in gambling houses and sometimes houses of prostitution. And one thing that he did a lot was served as referee for boxing matches, something that had been a lifelong love of his. In fact, he had started refereeing these fights when he was 19 or 20 years old. He was still doing it when he was getting older. Then 1930, he met Stuart Lake, a writer who was kind of like the second coming of Ned Buntline, who wrote a biography of Wyatt Earp that became a big bestseller in the early 1930s and made him a celebrity again. During the time right after the shootout at the corral, the Earps were in the newspapers all over the country, and then they just kind of disappeared from the newspapers after this vendetta ride. And in, let's say, 1920 or 1910, Wyatt Earp wasn't necessarily a household name and wasn't that well known. That really came back around again, even bigger than before in the 1930s. And he wound up being a consultant for Hollywood movies about cowboys and lawmen. And of course, the gunfight has lived on in popular culture with the Erbsen dog Holiday stalking down the dusty streets of Tombstone to their destiny over and over again, sometimes in surprising ways. Now we're going to talk about Wyatt Earp's other pal, Bat Masterson, alias Bartholomew William Barclay Masterson, actually born in Canada, in Quebec, to an Irish family, a family that moved around a lot from Canada to New York to Illinois to Missouri to, by the time Bat was a teenager, Kansas finally, farming in all those places. When Bat was 19 years old, he and his two older brothers, Ed and Jim, left the family farm and went farther west into Kansas to be buffalo hunters. This was in 1872, kind of the height of the buffalo hunting period. And while he was a buffalo hunter, his brothers weren't with him for this. This incident took place that we talked about in a previous lecture. In fact, that whole lecture was called Return to Adobe Walls. This was a situation when 28 buffalo hunters, Bat Masterson, young Bat Masterson among them, were pinned down in the ruins of the old trading post known as Adobe Walls, and were attacked by a combined force of Comanches, Kiowas, and some Southern Cheyenne, led by Quanah Parker. And they managed to hold off their attackers, only losing 4 of the 28 men because of the repeating rifles that they had and the fact that they had good cover behind those adobe walls. During his buffalo hunting days, an incident took place that perhaps was a sign of things to come for Bat Masterson. He and his brothers were hired by a contractor to grade some land for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which was coming through Kansas. And the contractor skipped out without paying them. After several months, the Masterson brothers learned that the contractor, whose name was Ritter, was on a train that was going to be stopping at Dodge City. So they went to Dodge City, and Bat got on the train, found Ritter, and pulled a gun on him and walked him through the train to the back end and out the back end of the caboose onto that little platform that you can see right there, and ordered him to pay up the $300 that he owed, which Ritter did, whereupon a large crowd of people around the train station who had been watching the whole thing erupted into applause, cheering young Bat Masterson on. Well, that was the Adobe Walls thing happened in June of '74. Within a couple of months, Masterson, Bat Masterson that is, got a job as scout for the U.S. Cavalry serving under Colonel Nelson Miles. And he went with Miles and his 5th Infantry for about 6 months, whereupon, at which time they had several encounters with Comanches and Cheyenne and also some Apaches, and recovered some young women who had been taken captive. Now, it was not long after that, in Sweetwater, Texas, in 1876, that Masterson was involved in his first gunfight. There was a disagreement between him and a cavalry corporal named Melvin King over a woman named Molly Brennan. And this argument, in Miss Brennan's presence, ended in gunfire, and the two men both drew their guns and shot at each other. And King was killed, and Bat was hit in the hip, which severely damaged his hip, and that's why he walked often with a cane or a walking stick in years after that. The following spring, he went to back to Dodge City in 1877, and he witnessed the town marshal there, Larry Deeger, arresting a fellow named Bobby Gill, and Masterson felt like that the marshal, who was a very large man, about 315 pounds, was bullying the guy. So he interceded and wrapped his arms around the 315-pound marshal, and the other guy got away. Some friends of the marshal grabbed Bat Masterson, and the marshal beat him with a pistol barrel. He buffaloed him, knocked him out, and took him to jail and charged him a $25 fine for disturbing the peace. And that was how he met Larry Deeger, and they never got along any better after that. However, perhaps a little bit ironically, within a couple of months, Bat Masterson was hired on as a deputy to the county sheriff, who at that time was Charlie Bassett. Bassett, his term was about to expire, and there were term limits. He had just served 2 terms, and he couldn't run again. And so he backed his new deputy, Bat Masterson, in a bid to be elected the county sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, where Dodge City is. His opponent was Larry Deeger. And Bat Masterson managed to win that election, barely, by only a handful of votes. So now, Bat Masterson, who's in his late 20s, is the sheriff of Ford County. And within a couple of months, the town marshal's office, which was vacant because Deeger had left that office to run for sheriff, it was filled by Bat's brother, actually, Ed Masterson, his oldest brother. So there for a while, for about a year or so, the Masterson brothers, 2 of the 3, were the top law officials in the city and the county there in Dodge City. It was during this time period that the story that we told earlier about Dave Rudabaugh, who had slipped away from Wyatt Earp down in Texas and headed back to Dodge City, was arrested by Bat Masterson. And then a couple of other train robbers were arrested as well by the Masterson brothers. We mentioned that Rudabaugh wound up essentially testifying against his own accomplices and got off on that one and was set free. About a year after the 2 Mastersons took their respective offices, Ed Masterson decided that he was going to try to put a lid on the violence and rowdiness in Dodge City by enforcing the ordinance against carrying firearms in the city. And that worked out fine for a while until he tried to disarm a drunken, armed cowboy named Jack Wagner. And the cowboy's boss, Ed Walker, I think his name was Alf Walker, was also present and also armed. Jack Wagner, the drunk cowboy, shot Ed Masterson and killed him. Bat arrived and he shot both the cowboys, killing Wagner and severely injuring Walker. So after this, with Ed Masterson now deceased, Charlie Bassett, former county sheriff, replaced Ed Masterson as the town marshal. So at this point, in 1878, you have Charlie Bassett as the marshal of Dodge City, and his deputies included Jim Masterson and Wyatt and James Earp. And you had Bat Masterson, the sheriff of Ford County, and one of his deputies, his top deputy, was a young man named Bill Tillman. Now, Bill Tillman, we briefly mentioned last time, he's going to wind up having a long career as a United States deputy marshal, and he's going to be a very highly regarded peace officer. In fact, we're going to talk about him in a little more detail. He's going to be the fourth famous lawman we talk about in this video. So that was quite a lineup. About a year later, in late 1879, year and a half, late 1879, the Earp brothers left Dodge City and moved out to Tombstone. And also at that time, Charlie Bassett stepped down as marshal. So after that, Jim Masterson became the town marshal of Dodge City. And one of his top deputies was a guy named Neil Brown. We saw him briefly earlier in that picture, that kind of group picture in Dodge City, and we'll talk about him again. So Bat Masterson's still sheriff. Now Jim Masterson is the town marshal. And it was during this time period before Jim Masterson became marshal in 1878-79 that this picture was probably taken of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson just kind of hanging out there in their dress shirts. Well, during this time period in October of 1878, situation developed there in Dodge City involving a saloon girl named Dora Hand. Her working name was Fanny. She sang 5 nights a week at the Alhambra Saloon and was extremely popular. She was sometimes called the Angel of Dodge City. She was one of those people with a heart of gold that everybody was fond of, especially this one cowboy named Spike Kennedy, who happened to be the son of a cattle baron. His father, I think his name was James Kennedy. Quite an influential guy in the region. Anyway, Spike Kennedy was madly in love with Dora Hand, but there was nothing to be done about it because Dora Hand had become the love interest of the mayor of Dodge City, a guy named Dog Kelly, who was an Englishman that had served for several years in the 7th Cavalry under Custer. He had left the cavalry in 1872, so he was with Custer during that Washita incident, but got out 4 years before the Little Bighorn. Anyway, Kennedy was just insanely jealous, and one night while he was drunk, he went outside the mayor's house and emptied his 6-gun through the window and the walls, the thin walls of the house, in hopes of killing Dog Kelly. Unfortunately for him, Dog Kelly wasn't home. The only person home sleeping in the mayor's bed was Dora Hand, and she was killed in this fusillade of bullets. So Spike Kennedy killed the girl he loved by accident and then got out of town fast. And he was pursued by a posse, and this is why I bring this up, because this posse was something else. It was the sheriff, Bat Masterson, his deputy, Bill Tillman, the deputy town marshal, Wyatt Earp, and Wyatt Earp's pal Doc Holliday. So can you imagine being pursued by Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Bat Masterson, and Bill Tillman? It's going to end in a bad day for you, and indeed it did. They caught up with him. At least they were within sight of him as he was galloping away on his horse. And Masterson dismounted from his horse and took out his rifle. And Wyatt Earp made a comment, a joking comment, about how it would be impossible to hit anything from such a distance. Of course, Wyatt Earp hadn't actually been a buffalo hunter. He had just said he was. Bat Masterson had been, and he was a very good rifle shot. And his shot brought down Spike Kennedy from a great distance. Didn't kill him. I think it hit him in the arm, but unsaddled him, and he was captured, brought back to Dodge City, and stood trial whereupon his dad bought off the jury and the judge, and he was let go. So very bad ending for Dora Hand, pretty bad ending for the mayor. Bad ending for Spike in that he killed his own love of his life and then got shot by Bat Masterson, but he did get to go home afterwards. After the Earps had moved away, Sheriff Bat Masterson was contacted by representatives from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad um, to engage his services in what came to be known as the Colorado Railroad War. Essentially, there were two railroads that were both claiming the same route or the same spot of area of land that they both wanted to go through, and they were arguing over who had the right of way. And so the Santa Fe Railroad asked Sheriff Masterson to take some people out there and basically put a thumb on the scale and make sure that the Santa Fe Railroad got what they wanted. And of course, Colorado has nothing to do with Kansas jurisdiction-wise, so he had no jurisdiction. But he headed out there, and he engaged about 50 or 60 people, a small army, to go with him, including such notable gunfighters as Doc Holliday, Ben Thompson, who we mentioned when we were talking about Wild Bill Hickok, and who was, well, he would later become a lawman, but he was more a gunfighter than a lawman, and Mysterious Dave Mather, and another Dave Rudabaugh, or Arizona Dave, or Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, who Masterson had arrested a year or two earlier. But now he engages him, and they head on out there, and they occupy a roundhouse, a railroad building, and refuse to give it up until the authorities in Colorado showed up, along with the representatives from the other railroad, eventually along with a cannon. And Masterson and his private army vacated. There were no fatalities in this railroad war, but the war dragged on in court for years and years. Now, after that, he went back to Dodge, went back to his job in Ford County. He hadn't technically left his job; he had just sort of left. So he went back, and he was contacted again by Ben Thompson, whom he had just recently been involved with. Thompson had a problem. Well, he had a little brother, and that was his problem. His brother Billy was a ne'er-do-well and a troublemaker that was getting Ben Thompson in trouble all the time, getting himself in trouble, and Ben having to try to get him out of it. Billy was up in Ogallala, Nebraska, in jail because he had shot a sheriff's thumb off. And Thompson asked his friend, Bat Masterson, who had quite a bit of sway and respect, if he would go up there, talk to the law officials, and see if he could get his brother Billy released. And so Bat agreed to do that, which was better than the alternative, which would have been Ben Thompson going up there and just shooting everybody. So he headed up that way. As he was on his way to Ogallala, he ran into somebody, Buffalo Bill Cody, and Buffalo Bill decided to come along with him. So Bat Masterson and Buffalo Bill showed up at the sheriff's office in Ogallala, Nebraska, and by that time, Bat Masterson was fairly well known in the West, and Buffalo Bill was a huge celebrity. So as you can imagine, their words carried a lot of weight and got Billy Thompson released. Now, we'll be talking more about Ben Thompson and his unfortunate brother, Billy. The unfortunate part was that he had a brother named Billy. When we talk about gunfighters, because like I said, Thompson was much more of a gunfighter than he was a lawman. Now, it turns out the people of Ford County, Kansas, as popular as Bat Masterson might have been, much preferred having a sheriff who was actually in Ford County, Kansas, doing things, as opposed to going off on private matters to Colorado and Nebraska and essentially being a Wild West celebrity. So he got defeated next election and was no longer the sheriff of Ford County. His brother was still brother Jim was still the marshal, I believe. Anyhow, Bat left Dodge City and just sort of for a while wandered the West. About a year later, he got word from his friend Wyatt Earp out there in Tombstone. Wyatt had just gotten that part ownership in the Oriental Saloon, and he wanted help getting it all set up, and he also wanted a little help just with the situation that was going on there in Tombstone. So Bat Masterson and Luke Short, the gambler, headed out there to Tombstone and helped Wyatt to get his operations underway. Bat Masterson only stayed there for about 4 months because he got word from Dodge City that his brother Jim was having problems and his life was in danger. So he dropped everything, headed back to Dodge, and saw the people that threatened his brother, and they started shooting at each other, and nobody got hit, fortunately, because the whole thing had already been resolved before Bat Masterson got there. So after that, he served a couple of other peace officer positions briefly. He was the town marshal in Trinidad, Colorado, which his brother Jim later was also the town marshal in Trinidad, Colorado. Jim, by the way, also just sort of he left Dodge City and he was in Colorado, and then he served as town marshal in various places around the West, and eventually became a deputy United States marshal, and would be involved in the 1890s in the Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, pursuits of the Dalton Gang and the Doolin Gang. And then later in the 1890s, he died, Jim Masterson, of tuberculosis at the age of 39. Well, Bat Masterson, like I said, he had a couple of peace officer positions. 1883, went back to Dodge City again, this time at the request of Luke Short. Luke Short had been run out of town by the new mayor of Dodge City, Larry Deeger. Yes, that Larry Deeger, the one that had pistol whipped Bat Masterson some years earlier. So several of Luke Short's friends converged on Dodge City to sort of pressure the mayor by their very presence into relenting and getting Luke Short reestablished there in the town, which is what happened. And so that's the story behind this famous photograph. About half of these people we've talked about in detail. Now, after this, Bat Masterson worked various things, most of them involving gambling, actually. He ran some saloons and some gambling houses, and he got really involved, much as Wyatt Earp did, in prize fighting, not doing it himself. Wyatt Earp got involved in refereeing the things. Bat Masterson got involved in, initially betting on them, but in writing about them. And so this is an unexpected twist. Bat Masterson wound up moving to New York City and spending the remaining decades of his life as a sports writer in New York City until he passed away in the 1920s. So there he is in his later years, in his 60s. Now, of course, Masterson had also become very famous. In fact, Bat Masterson was famous in his prime, more famous than Wyatt Earp was at the time, which is kind of ironic considering that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, It seems that people younger than me have, Bat Masterson has been completely forgotten, but some people still know who Wyatt Earp is. Anyhow, much like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson got the 1950s TV treatment. Here's Gene Barry, who played Bat Masterson in a TV show called The Adventures of Bat Masterson, which ran, I think, from about 1950, I think it's 57 to 61, something like that, late 50s through the early 60s. And he was portrayed as being, as this TV guide kind of reflects, a real dandy, a little bit snooty, a little bit fancy. Now, it is true that most of our photographs of Bat Masterson, he's dressed up. But a lot of people got dressed up when they got their picture taken. Anyway, that's the TV version of Bat Masterson, which is at least a little bit closer in appearance to the actual one than these guys, right? It never ceases to amaze me, the 1950s versions of these Western historical figures. Significantly less hairy in every instance. But there you have it. So these three guys that we've just talked about, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, probably the top three most famous lawmen from the Old West. Wyatt Earp coming to it a little bit late so far as getting the celebrity. Had some infamy, but he got the celebrity later in life. Wild Bill didn't get to have a later in life, but Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson did. We still have two or three more people I want to talk about who are not, I know this is called famous lawmen. These next three, famous to people who really know a lot about the cowboy era, but not household names. And I think that's unfortunate. These are three people coming up that I think should be a lot more famous. And I would go so far as to say that all three of them were a lot more competent and maybe more dangerous than these three more famous ones. We're going to start with Bill Tillman, truly one of the all-time greats, whose career spanned more than 50 years, starting in Dodge City and ending in Oklahoma. Now, he had been born in Iowa, but his family moved to Kansas when he was only 3 years old in the mid-1850s. Much like Bat Masterson in the early 1870s, he was a buffalo hunter and later moved to Dodge City. The official record states that his first appearance on the scene as a peace officer was in 1878 when he became the deputy sheriff of Ford County under Bat Masterson. But Tillman and his wife said that he had actually started as deputy sheriff in 1874 under Charlie Bassett. There are no records to that effect, but that's what they said. So either way, 1870s he was serving as a deputy sheriff, and when Bat Masterson left that office, Tillman stayed on as deputy sheriff until 1884, when he became the marshal of Dodge City. Also, during that time, actually in the 1870s, he was late 1870s, he was co-owner of a saloon called the Oasis, which is one of the other saloons in Dodge City and Gunsmoke, by the way. And he had a small ranch there outside Dodge City in Ford County, Kansas, but most of his cattle were killed in the big die-up, the big blizzard of 86 and 87. Even after serving a couple of years as town marshal, he still continued to serve as deputy sheriff until 1889. and was involved in several exciting escapades during that time period. Then in '89, when the first Oklahoma land boom happened, he was one of those people that were there to stake their claim, and stake a claim he did, which he built some commercial property in what later became Oklahoma City, and used the rent money he got from that to set himself up as a rancher there. But for most of the time throughout the 1890s, Tillman served as a United States Deputy Marshal operating out of the Fort Smith Court District and answering to hanging Judge Isaac Parker, trying to get a lid on things, particularly with the Dalton gang, and particularly in Tillman's case with the Doolin gang. Now, later, when we talk in detail about the Dalton and Doolin gangs, Tillman is going to play a large role in that story. He worked closely with two other Deputy U.S. Marshals, Heck Thomas, whom we have already talked about in our previous lecture, and Chris Madsen, who was a Danish immigrant. The three of them were frequently partners, working together, leading posses against the Daltons, and like I said, particularly against the Doolins. They came to be known as the Three Guardsmen of Oklahoma. Finally, at the end of the decade, by 1899, there was no more hanging Judge Parker at Fort Smith. The Daltons and Doolins had been caught, and Tillman was starting to get up in years. So he actually, what he did was went into politics, and he became a state senator in Oklahoma. On one occasion, in a visit to New York City, he caught up with his old friend Bat Masterson, who by that time, of course, was a sports writer in New York City. And Bat Masterson introduced him to President Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt actually later invited him to have a spot there at the inauguration of Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft. By the 19-teens, Tillman was producing and acting in movies about his own life, and you can see him here. I think this was from 1915. But by the 1920s, having not achieved overwhelming success in his endeavors to be a big-time producer, he was back in law enforcement in his late 60s, working as a special investigator for the state of Oklahoma. And in that capacity in the 1920s, he was operating in boom towns once again. He'd started off in cattle towns, in cattle boom towns in Kansas. Now the boom towns in Oklahoma were oil towns. And by this point, the bad guys rode Model Ts and carried Thompson submachine guns. Finally, in 1924, at the age of 70, Tillman, who was investigating a corrupt prohibition officer, sought to disarm said officer, who was drunk. And the guy, his name was Wiley, had a second hideout pistol on his person, which he then drew and shot and killed Bill Tillman. So that was the end of his career, dying in the dusty streets of Cromwell, Oklahoma in 1924. Unlike Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, there were not any 1950s TV series about Bill Tillman. There were no movies made in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s about Bill Tillman. Every once in a great while, he might appear as a minor supporting character in a random episode of a TV Western, and he was sort of alluded to in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, like I mentioned. But it wasn't until 1999 when a movie was finally made that focused completely on Bill Tillman, and it focused on that last period of his life, the 1920s. It starred Sam Elliott as Bill Tillman. The movie was called You Know My Name. It was based on a novel by Matt Braun that had been entitled One Last Town. And I think in the 21st century he's shown up a time or two in westerns, but still not a household name. Although he did get to be on a postage stamp in the 1990s. Nonetheless, Bill Tillman, for what it's worth, I think that most aficionados of the Old West and historians would agree that he was, like I said earlier, probably a lot more competent than the more famous ones. He just didn't have the colorful nature, and he didn't attract the attention of any Ned Buntlines or Stuart Lakes to manufacture mythologies about him. So, Bill Tillman, remember that name. Next, we're going to look at El Fego Baca, who was a Chicano man in New Mexico who, at the age of 19, was appointed a deputy sheriff in the county of Socorro in New Mexico. Not long afterwards, an incident took place. If you notice how many of these stories I start that way, an incident took place on the streets of Frisco in which Deputy Sheriff Baca tried to disarm a drunken cowboy. Do you notice a theme here? In this case, as he attempted to disarm the cowboy, a bunch of the cowboy's friends rushed over to help him, and a fight ensued with several people versus the one deputy sheriff who was getting the worst of it. However, he fought back, wound up shooting the horse of the foreman of the ranch where these cowboys worked, and shot one of the cowboys in the knee. More cowboys at this time were coming toward the melee, and you have to think that the fact that this was a Latino law officer may have had something to do with the sheer number of cowboys that came to the aid of this one drunken guy. Anyway, Baca took refuge in the home of a Latino man there in town, an adobe house. The cowboys surrounded the house. There were at least 40 of them. Some accounts have as many as 80. A rancher was sent to the house to pound on the door and demand that Baca come out with his hands up, but the young deputy refused. By the way, there was nobody else home when he went into this house. He refused, and then the cowboys opened fire, accidentally killing the guy they had sent that told him to surrender. And it's difficult to say exactly how many shots were fired into that house. 400 bullets, 400 bullet holes, were in the wooden door. Some estimates are that about 4,000 bullets were fired into the house or at the house. However, this was an adobe house in New Mexico, and that style of house, it was not unusual for the floor to be down below ground level because that keeps things cooler. So he was able to crouch down, and then all those bullets flying into the house just went right over his head, and none of them hit him, and he was able to return fire and killed 4 of the cowboys and wounded 8 more. The fusillade continued until they ran out of bullets and went home. They did accuse him of murder, of murdering those four cowboys, but when he was taken to court and the wooden door with 400 bullet holes in it was introduced, it seemed pretty obvious that it was self-defense. So, end result was that Baca actually became quite highly regarded, and the next year was elected sheriff of Socorro County. He served as sheriff from 1885 to 1888, then became a deputy United States Marshal for a couple of years. After that, he became a private detective from 1890 to 1894, and during that time he was studying for the bar, which he passed in 1894 and became a lawyer. Worked as an attorney in Socorro from 1894 to 1902, and after that he went into politics. Over the next decade, at various times, he served as school superintendent, attorney general, and mayor of Socorro. Finally, in 1913, he was sent to Mexico by the United States government as a U.S. diplomat during the Huerta administration in Mexico, where he served for 3 years until 1916. He was involved in democratic politics after that, and lived until the end of World War II, when he passed away at the age of 80. Now, unlike Bill Tillman, El Fuego Baca did get the 1950s TV series treatment, a Disney TV series called The Incredible El Fuego Baca. And El Fuego Baca, the famous Latino lawman of the Old West, was played by a white guy named Robert Forrester. At least, though, he did get to keep his mustache. Oh, and he also got a statue in New Mexico on the site of his famous standoff. The sixth and final lawman we're going to look at in this lecture is Bass Reeves, who was born a slave in Arkansas. In fact, his owner was an Arkansas state senator who was a Confederate officer during the Civil War, and when he went off to war, he took his slave, Bass Reeves, with him to be his servant. However, at some point early on in the war, Reeves escaped and made his way to Indian Territory, where he lived the rest of his life. And over the next several years after arriving there, he learned to track and to hunt, and also learned to speak the languages of all 5 of the civilized tribes of Indian Territory. Later on, in 1875, right after Judge Isaac Parker took the bench in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Bass Reeves was one of the first groups, was a member of the first group of United States Deputy United States Marshals that were hired on to operate out of the court in Fort Smith. And in fact, he was one of, and possibly the most effective of those federal marshals in his career, which lasted for 37 years. He arrested somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 individuals, including his own son, actually, in I think it was 1902. His own son, who had killed his wife, and Reeves arrested him and brought him in, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And he was actually let out after 11 years. Anyhow, Reeves did his duty, did his job. Over the course of those years, he probably, well, some accounts say that he killed 14 criminals in the line of duty, and some say 20. But he was very effective. He brought them back, and continued serving as United States Marshal until 1907, when Oklahoma became a state. And then he wound up working in Muskogee at the police department for a couple of more years after that before he retired. Well, Reeves was, by the way, this is a picture of him in 1907 at the end of his career as a federal marshal. Reeves also, much like Bill Tillman, did not have a 1950s TV show about him, but in recent years he has started to come into the public consciousness. It started in the early 1970s when historians started turning their attention to minorities in the West, not just the white guys, but the black and brown individuals and the women and so on. And during that time, he started to be mentioned in the history books after having been left out of the history for the better part of a century. Finally, in 1906, I'm sorry, 2006. I've been in the Old West too long. In 2006, a biography of Bass Reeves, a very good one, Black Gun, Silver Star, was written by Oklahoma historian Art Burton, who had written about Reeves a couple of times before in some of his other books about Oklahoma history. And this really helped to bring Reeves to the public attention because the book did really well and was mentioned in a lot of media appearances, talked about quite a bit, to the extent that even though you never saw Bass Reeves showing up in TV westerns or movie westerns all through the 20th century, in the 21st century, he has, in fact, shown up increasingly more so. Several different TV shows he has made an appearance occasionally as a character, a sporting character in a film, and more recently as the lead in several films that have been made, and a TV series. Had his own TV series finally in Paramount Plus, Bass Reeves, and much like El Fego Baca, also he has his own statue in Fort Smith, Arkansas, right outside the courthouse where Judge Parker presided. You can see it here. He's on the trail, his faithful dog trotting along. Bass Reeves loved dogs. On one occasion, one of his prisoners harmed his dog, and that did not end well for the prisoner. So Bass Reeves finally is getting his due, and in fact, more so than Bill Tillman or El Fego Baca, and apparently even Bat Masterson. He is on his way to becoming a household name in the 21st century. All right, I could go on forever. There are any number of other lawmen that we could talk about, but I particularly wanted to talk about these six. So next, of course, going to have to talk about the bad men.